Let's start off with my side of the pond. I'm again in London. If you're new to this podcast, Barry is tuned in via Skype in Johannesburg in South Africa. And yeah, let's tackle some of those things. So, the Bank of England has cut their interest rate to the lowest level in history again. Last week we chatted about the rate that was set back then, and it's been dropped further again, now to 0.1%. Some pretty crazy measures.
Definitely, I think it's par for the course. I think all the governments around the world are trying to find ways to cushion that economic blow, and by moving interest rates, that's one of the only levers these guys have to actually make things happen. So it's not too surprising. I think, Chad, we're on the road, especially in the UK, towards negative interest rates, right? So we've seen in the US and in some of Scandinavia, we've seen negative interest rates in the past, and they don't quite make sense in my brain, but they are legit and they are real. And for some reason, I think the UK is on that route, right? I don't think this is the bottom. I think as things get worse, it could even go below zero.
Yeah, crazy thought that to have to actually pay interest to have money in an account, but certainly not something we're going to rule out just right now. Some of the other things that happened this past week, UK schools were asked to close. This is something we spent quite a lot of time talking about last week. Looks like some common sense prevailed there and they actually closed those. Further to this, some 40 tube stations in London were shut down, and basically around 80% of the lines, general day-to-day was actually cut short. Bars, restaurants, cafes, cinemas, theaters, leisure centers, and gyms were banned as well. And on top of this, basically last night being Monday, there was the escalation of a lockdown. Which obviously we've been seeing across the globe. Strange now to finally see back on my home turf as well. And yeah, definitely feels weird being on this side of the lockdown. So just to clarify what this actually means, the default position, we obviously watched Boris Johnson putting out his press briefing, and it was quite a formal one, really. It was almost looked like a recorded message. He was reading off of an auto cue, something you definitely it definitely sets the tone for anyone watching that. But essentially, you must stay home. That's the default position. You can leave home in a set of certain circumstances, which are to go shopping. This is for essentials like food and medicine. You're allowed to leave the house for one form of exercise per day. This must be alone or with a member of your own household. So if previously you were meeting up with the guy down the street to go for a run and keep 2 meters distance, that is no longer happening, just you or the people in your own household. You can leave the house for a medical need, or if you are one of these key workers, there's a specific list that the government has put out of who is and isn't a key worker. You obviously need to travel to and from work. So that's essentially all of the conditions from which you can leave the house. What he mentioned was that the police will be equipped to address people who do not follow by these rules, and could even fine them. So yeah, certainly quite a lockdown we're seeing on this side.
Lots of interesting developments there. And why I think it's interesting, Chad, is because we chatted last week about the fact that the UK was probably doing something different to the rest of the world. And they were
Yep.
trying to delay these sorts of measures because they thought they wanted to try and time the peak a bit better. So this feels to me a little bit like a 180 shift. I don't know what it feels like on the ground, but does this feel like a change in strategy from the UK?
It definitely does. Completely a complete change. I think, like you said, they've been kind of erring on the conservative side of this. Obviously, excuse the pun there. But yeah, certainly kind of getting into these measures in a sort of step-by-step approach, which is interesting because, as we know, there's a lag on the data. As the data comes out in terms of how many cases there are, and a lot of tests actually not being done. So it's been interesting to see that approach has been followed. But I completely agree with you there. It does feel like a 180 degree on this side, and so certainly everyone is within their means and within their rights to feel a little bit panicked, which I suppose is human nature, really. So yeah, really interesting to see that. The one thing that I wanted to mention about the police point is that straight after the briefing, a couple of minutes later, the chairman of the Met Office actually made a statement to say that they hadn't been briefed by government on this, and they weren't actually equipped to handle this, which is really quite an interesting one.
Yeah, that is crazy. I mean, you'd assume everyone is talking to each other and everyone's in the same meetings. But I'm guessing with the kind of speed that things are happening and how urgent this is, I'm sure things are changing on an hour by hour basis. And so definitely kind of an embarrassing mixed messaging there. I mean, you obviously want to show like one unified front as a government with all the public services behind it, and
Yeah.
especially in a lockdown like this, the police are super important. So it's really not a good sign if your police and your government aren't seeing eye to eye so much. So hopefully they'll rectify that in the coming days, and that the strategy and whatever the lockdown's going to look like on the UK side, that everyone's on the same page.
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, just to talk about that 180 as well, I think a lot of people have been kind of enacting this as a lockdown for the past couple of days anyway. But I mean, obviously, like I said, you may have still met up with a friend in the park to go for a walk and kept that 2 meter distance. That's now not happening anymore. If you needed to go to the shops for anything specific, I mean, I went to go and buy puzzles just to keep us busy. You kind of saw an empty mall anyway, but there were still shops trading. That's now changed. So any shop that is not considered essential has to shut their doors. And effectively, we've seen this as an overnight lockdown, which is certainly interesting. And we'll chat about the timing a little bit later on. Some of the other things, obviously, to mitigate these effects, if we look on the economic effects of such a change, is some of the measures that government have announced to sort of ease the blow for the people of the country. And so we've actually seen government announce a whole suite of things. First thing being £330 billion of available cash in the form of business loans. I don't know about you, Barry, but I can't comprehend the amount of cash that is. £330 billion.
It's a staggering amount of money. I just did a quick Google search, and it's about 7.6 trillion South African rand, to put it in
Wow.
perspective. So
Wow.
it is a ginormous amount of money. And I think coming from the UK, that kind of spending shows you how serious this is.
Definitely. Everyone looked at that number and saw it as a huge number. And then government introduced a couple more measures. So one being an additional £20 billion in grants for certain small businesses. So obviously very different to a loan. And additionally, and this one for me is quite staggering and quite a big thing to take on, the government really just flexing their muscle here, where they are offering to pay up to 80% of employees' wages up to £2,500 a month for 3 months. Massive, massive benefit that.
Yeah, definitely. It's one of those things that really shows the wealth of a country like the UK, when they have the pockets to be able to do these sorts of things. And like we'll chat about throughout this episode, like the impact on employees and the impact on small businesses is going to be immense from this. And so trying to cushion this blow with this kind of support is an incredible thing to do. And it's the reason that Britain are going to be okay throughout all of this, right? If you're able to keep your economy relatively stable throughout these turbulent times, then you set yourself up for a good recovery and a good getting back to normal at the end of the day. And so it's huge amounts of money. The question, of course, always comes down to how is this actually practically done? So how do you efficiently deploy this sort of capital? How do you make sure the money is going to the right people in the right places? And so obviously there's a lot of work to do still to try and figure out, cool, we've got this fund of cash, we've got this little war chest, how do we distribute it? And that's going to be where the rubber hits the road. But on a pure numbers basis, it really should come as some comfort to those living in the UK that the government are really doing their best to make sure that economically the economy survives.
Absolutely. I mean, from the loan side, from what I understand, is all of the sort of high street lenders and commercial banks. You'll still go to them for funding, and the extra tool that they'll have at their disposal is now an 80% government-backed guarantee for this money. So potentially people who wouldn't have ordinarily attracted funding because of a certain level of risk, etc. That might now throw that equation a little bit over, which is an interesting tool to have, like you said, in this war chest. And that's also an interesting term to use, is that Boris Johnson last night spoke of this government as a wartime government. We are fighting, like we said in our last episode, the invisible enemy. Quite interesting.
Yeah, it certainly feels like that. I mean, I've never lived through a time like this, and I've never lived through a time where there's this kind of global energy around a certain topic, where there's this sort of like mass concern and mass worry about a certain thing. So it kind of feels like a war, right? It feels like we're fighting this enemy we can't see, we can't predict, we don't know where it is, but everyone is trying to rally together. And the kind of rationing we've seen, the kind of lockdowns we're going to see throughout the next few weeks, that really does feel like a war.
And then the last thing on the UK point, Barry, there's been some controversy that the one group of people who haven't really been addressed by these government's measures that they've put in place are those who are self-employed or who are freelancers. You and I were chatting about the people who work in the West End. It's like that gig type economy, those 0-hour contracts, and all of these people, all of those theatres obviously being instructed to close, a lot of these people not being addressed because they weren't on a payroll at the end of February. Really, really terrible times for them.
Yeah, I think so. I think it really points to the fact that our working world has shifted so much over the last few decades, right? So the traditional way of working where you got paid by an employer and they looked after your benefits and all that good stuff, the world doesn't look like that anymore. There's a huge sector of, like you say, gig workers or people in theaters and whatnot who are working on a project basis, of freelancers, of self-employed people. The working world has changed so much, and so this is really going to shine a light on that and show that the legislation we have in place and kind of the laws we have and all this good stuff might not be perfectly suited to how the working world looks today. So hopefully this might shift some thinking around how do we actually help those people. I know for myself, Chad, I've basically been freelancing and consulting for the last year or so, and so I feel this pain directly. And like you said, I've got a lot of friends who are in theatre worldwide, across the West End, here in South Africa, etc. And they're really in trouble because they don't have those benefits behind them. So it's like, how do you support, like, this gig economy is good because it allows flexibility. It theoretically allows more fulfillment for certain people. It's an interesting way of building our economy. But then when something like this happens, do you have the support structures in place, or are you trying to build them as the plane is going down?
Absolutely. You're not alone there, Barry. I'm also directly affected by this, and we'll certainly see what the UK government have to add to these measures. I certainly feel the social pressure will build up. What they have done, which is very limited, is they've taken a piece of legislation called IR35, which was put there really to tax people who are seen to be employees, who are kind of running their consultancies through their own companies as employees. And so what they've done is they've delayed the escalation of that, where essentially companies who provide you with contracts now need to assess whether you could be included as an employee, whereas previously the consultant themselves could make that assessment, and they've now delayed that for a year. So certainly will have a little bit of an effect, but at the moment people are just not hiring contractors at all.
Yeah, I think that's one of the side effects of this, is that anyone who doesn't have a permanent kind of set job in a big corporation is really going to struggle, simply because these kinds of jobs, like you say, are just not guaranteed. Like, what you gain in flexibility and what you gain in control of your hours and whatnot, you lose in stability. So when something like this happens, we go through these kind of times, you really are the first to lose out. And so I think it really speaks to the fact that the working world has changed, but the way we think about social security and the way we think about stabilization of our economy hasn't changed yet. And so hopefully when we start seeing these side effects and we see the impact it has on these kind of economies, we can change the way we operate. I mean, I'm thinking about companies like Uber and whatnot who have these giant masses of contract workers who are in serious danger now. But Uber don't have a direct contact with each of those drivers, for example. So how do you, as a society, look after those people when they are outside of traditional employment paradigms and therefore aren't able to get like legal assistance and those sorts of things regarding the benefits? It's a lot to think about.
Absolutely. Really quite a conundrum that we'll only have to see over the next couple of months what unfolds. Across the pond.